Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from Hebrew College's Shulman Graduate School of Jewish Education. In their master's degree program, learn to engage diverse Jewish communities and develop expertise to address pressing contemporary issues. The program can be completed online from anywhere in the world or on campus just outside of Boston. Generous scholarships are available. Learn more and reflect back on Passover by downloading the article The Four Neurodivergent Children by Rachel Figura-Smith at www.hebrewcollege.edu/unbound. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 172, Judaism with Purposes. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And as we get towards the close of this Omer period, the 7-week period between Passover and Shavuot, we're starting to turn in the direction of putting some of the pieces together, or at least giving a toolbox for you to try to put together some of those pieces. And so today's guest, Ayalon Eliach, is someone who's thinking a lot about halacha, a word that potentially has a variety of meanings that we've interpreted in the past as a Jewish way or a Jewish going, and that is often translated as Jewish law, but that's not the way we're going to talk about it today. Ayalon Eliach is the Director of Learning and Strategic Communications at the Lippman Kampfer Foundation for Living Torah, a family foundation whose mission is to help people apply particular Jewish wisdom to universal human questions. You might remember that we had two guests from the Lippman Kampfer Foundation for Living Torah over 2 years ago, Jonathan Wucher of blessed memory and Lee Moore. Ayalon Eliach has been thinking about the potential role of halacha in our times in new ways for a long period of time. He was influenced by his Orthodox upbringing, his academic study of religion at Yale, and his training as both a lawyer and a rabbi. Ayalon Eliach has rabbinical ordination from the Hebrew College Rabbinical School in the Boston area, and he's written a number of articles about halacha and is working on an essay that he hopes to expand into a book. We've been talking to Ayalon for years about these ideas, and we're thrilled to finally be able to share some of these conversations with you on Judaism Unbound. So, Ayalon Eliach, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a thrill to finally have you on.
I'm thrilled to be here and really big fan of the show, so looking forward to talking with both of you.
I think that one of the interesting things is that there aren't that many people that are not Orthodox or very observant conservative Jews who are even interested in this question of halacha, however we define it. And yet you and I are really interested in that. And I think Lex too. But part of it comes from the fact that you and I both grew up in Orthodox communities. And when you leave that community, you leave it for a reason. And yet at the same time, I think that you're aware of certain elements of Judaism that are available that are not actually generally part of the Jewish life in non-Orthodox communities. And you say, well, what would it look like if it was? So I would love it if you could bring us in a little bit to your life story and the way in which you started to think about this question of what halacha is all about and why we should even care about it.
Like you, I grew up in an Orthodox community. I grew up in the modern Orthodox community on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And for me growing up, halacha wasn't an element of Jewish life. In many ways, if not in all ways, it was the defining element of Jewish life. For every single thing I did from the moment I woke up until the moment I went to sleep, there was an instruction, a rule, a norm for how I should do it. There was literally not a facet of life that didn't have some element of it that was informed or had instructions for how it should be lived out in halacha. And I found that incredibly powerful and incredibly grounding, that there were so many decisions that needed to be made on a daily basis, and I didn't have to carry the weight of making every single one of them in the moment. And that was incredibly comforting and valuable. What I found, though, as I got older and moved out of that community or had my first interactions outside of that community, was that the answers to those questions of daily life, that halacha or the halacha that I was brought up and offered, no longer made sense to me. They didn't work. They didn't get at particular goals or purposes that I still found compelling. And so for a large part of my life, I saw myself as living outside of halacha. The rules, the practices that what I understood as halakha prescribing no longer made sense to me. Eventually, however, I found that led to a real emptiness in a certain aspect of my life, not an emptiness in terms of a need of being told what to do. I think that the coercive element of a certain understanding of halakha is not what's missing. But as I began to appreciate the complexity of life in a more robust way than I did as a child, and even as a teenager or as a young adult, I really began to appreciate how helpful it could be to have the insight and inputs and wisdom of multiple generations thinking about how to live life well. As I understand it today, halakha is really the cumulative body of wisdom of Jewish thought on how to live well. And it offers rules, norms, practices, rituals for the practice of life. And the practice of life is not an easy thing. And I think that we could always use as much wisdom as we can get. And thousands of years of wisdom is a great place to start.
For those of our listeners who have not had a lot of contact with Orthodox communities, with Orthodox life, people are really living within Judaism as their legal system, as the system, like as you described, that it governs every aspect of their life. I would say the way that you described it, which I think is accurate, more so than the legal system. Because, when I wake up in the morning and I decide how to put my shoes on, I'm not thinking, what does American law require about this? It doesn't require anything. And yet Jewish law does have opinions about that and about literally everything. And so not only is it a legal system, but it's a legal system that is much more intimately connected to literally every part of your life. When we talk about halakha in the kind of way that you and I think, are interested in, and that we imagine some kind of future version of this that's not a legal system, can you help us understand a little bit what makes something halakha? What makes something that we should use that terminology to talk about, now not defined as law, but defined as a way or something like that, versus what I think everybody is open to, which is there's a whole lot of Jewish practices out there, and some of them are good and that we like them, and some of them aren't so great anymore. We don't like them so much, and so we should do the ones that we like. So what is the difference between that and some kind of new approach to halakha as you see it?
I think we're already at a place where halakha is not law. As much as many communities use the word law to describe halakha, I don't think they use the word law in that context in the same way as they use it in other contexts. And I think we could parse that from a number of perspectives, but most importantly, one of the aspects of law that I think, at least in the popular imagination, is really critical to any understanding of law is the element of coercion or the element of force. And for most American Jews, the statistics bear this out. There is no belief in any supernatural coercion around Jewish practice. And there certainly isn't communal or institutional enforcement around practice. And so I think by using the word law to describe halakha in its present context for most American Jews today, we're using terminology that doesn't really fit with the thing that we're describing. So I just want to bring that in as a preface to this next part, which is, if I'm understanding your question, it's, well, why should we think of these practices, these norms, these rituals in terms of halakha and not a selection process where we say we like this particular practice and we don't like this particular practice, so we are going to go with this Jewish practice and not this one. And I think what halakha offers that this picking and choosing doesn't is actually a few things. So first of all, I think commitment to halakha is a commitment to a process in which we interrogate the tradition in a really robust way and with a hermeneutics of curiosity and not a hermeneutics of suspicion, where we're really curious to understand what made the tradition, what made the past offer us in the present day, and really try to ask that about almost every area of life, and not to assume that the way things have been handed down to us or the way we've inherited them today is the only way that can be done, and to really try to look at the purpose of those practices, and then to try and assess whether or not the current form of them is achieving the goals that we think they can be achieving, and then trying to figure out how we can apply those purposes in our own lives today, very likely through new forms. The model of picking and choosing, or at least what that commonly associates, is that we have a menu. We have a set menu, and then therefore we are selecting things from it and leaving other things behind. And while that's certainly a component of the process, I think what it fails to do is to ask, especially about all those things that are no longer working, and I think that body has grown increasingly over time, what purpose those things have played in people's lives, and if there's anything else that's playing that role in our lives today. And I think, unfortunately, very often the things that are left behind are not replaced by something better. And I think a commitment to halakha is a commitment to constantly asking what's the thing that replaces it, and being involved in a discourse of Jewish tradition to try to find answers to that.
So you use this phrase set menu, and the word menu gets me hungry, gets me thinking about food, because, menus, restaurants, food, they all weave together. And it got me, so I know that you are interested in questions of food. So I wanted to think about, as maybe a way to flesh this out a little bit, kashrut. I wanted to bring that up because I actually don't think it's a separate conversation. I think that it's the same set of issues that you've started to talk about already, but I think you've fleshed it out beautifully in some pieces that you've written. But I'm also thinking back to that episode we had recently with Leon Wiener-Dow, because I think this is in many ways a Gemara to that Mishnah, a commentary to that initial word. But he talked all about keeping kosher as the context where halakha sort of opened up for him. And I don't know this about you for sure. I'm curious to hear, but the sense I get from your writing is that how we eat and what we eat is also a very live issue for you and how it relates to this. So how would you apply some of the conversations thus far of practice, of purpose, of halakha to eating?
I listened to most of your episodes. I listened to the one with Leon Dow. And in that conversation, you talked about the prohibition on combining meat and dairy. And then the conversation went specifically to how that gets to combining fowl, birds, and dairy. And Leon Dow said that it comes from a mistake in one of the commentaries, but because of a fidelity to the tradition, I'm imposing my words on what he said, I'm going to continue perpetuating that mistake in fidelity to the ongoing discourse. And what struck me about that is that I think that's often the commonly understood approach to what it means to have fidelity to tradition. And I think that's, while certainly a valid approach, I think there's a much more, to me, compelling approach, which is that fidelity is to the underlying function. And so going to that example of mixing meat and dairy, I think the ultimate question is, well, what exactly is the purpose of not mixing meat and dairy? And I know you spoke about it in that episode. One of the commonly cited theories behind it is that it's about avoiding cruelty to animals, and not cultivating cruelty within ourselves, that we would eat a parent and child at the same meal. When it comes to that specific question of eating birds and dairy, I think that it leads us to an entirely different answer. And that approach, opening that question, is not a new process. Already in the Talmud, there were debates about whether or not one eats dairy and fowl. And I think that part of that is that in large part, we've lost this process of having multiple answers to the same question. And I think that at its best, halakha actually opens the door to having those multiple questions. So one of the things that I think about a lot when it comes to kashrut, when it comes to having a food practice, is the way that meat consumption or animal consumption is generally treated. Now, most of the time, what we see is that there are two polar opposites, and I know this is something that you've talked about on the show. One approach is to say that the answer should be to completely eliminate the eating of animals and to go towards vegetarianism. And I think that is one perfectly, that to me, that is one halachic read, especially if that's grounded in the discourse around trying to find the purpose of these different practices. I think another approach that we often see, however, is what we have inherited as kashrut as the operating framework. And so that would mean that for someone who eats animals, it involves slaughtering the animal and cutting its throat at a specific point, and then salting the flesh and letting the blood drain. And then if someone is interested in ethical concerns, those go on top of all those other considerations. But I think what that misses is actually asking the question of what those practices are for in the first place. So taking something as simple as slaughtering an animal on its throat, many of the classical commentaries on halakha have the theory that this is actually an attempt to have the most humane slaughter possible for an animal. Now, when we look at what we know today from science, shlita, which is the traditional ritual slaughter of an animal, offers a level of painless death that at best is on par with stunning animals in the way that's done in most what's generally considered non-kosher slaughter. But at the same time, there is a almost universal recognition that human error rate when it comes to ritual slaughter, shlita, is significantly higher because it's done by hand and because there's no stunning beforehand. And so I think that gets to a question of if we're approaching halakha by asking what the actual purpose is, what the function is, and then having the form follow, that necessitates an entirely different approach to the actual practice of what it would look like to slaughter an animal in the first place for those who choose to eat animals. And so I think that approaching kashrut and eating practices in this way, in a reimagining of halakha, demands really asking about every single practice that we have, what the goal is that we're trying to achieve, and how we could best achieve it today.
I'm flashing back a little bit to Passover because every year Passover rolls around, and what I often see happen is like the following sequence. Somebody will post on Facebook or say something, they'll say something about how hard it is and how annoying it is to have to not eat certain foods on Passover, and then somebody else will reply or express sort of an annoyance that like, no, it's not about not eating chametz, not eating the leavened stuff. It's not about any of these particular things that we give up. It's about you do this to remember freedom and the ideas of liberation and of slavery and the whole narrative of the Exodus story. The matzah is to commemorate this hasty leave from Egypt, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And what's funny is I have a reaction of like, well, you're both right and you're both wrong. It is true that people forget about the meaning and forget about the values. But also, I'm not fully convinced that like the purpose of these rituals is entirely to remember freedom and liberation and the story of slavery and the narrative of leaving Egypt. Like, I do think there's also this level of like just sort of distinguishing us from society, having rituals that we practice and repeat because we practice and repeat them and it unites us as a people. These things that people will bring up as sort of defenses of rituals that might not have an articulable purpose. And so I guess I was curious to hear from you, like, given that you're talking beautifully about how we can recover or uncover or discover the purposes of various rituals and sort of remap our practices to fit those purposes. Like, what do we do if an eating ritual or a different Jewish ritual like doesn't have a discernible purpose, or perhaps more disconcertingly has a purpose that we actually think is a bad purpose?
I want to be clear that when I say we're trying to uncover purpose or trying to discover purpose, it's not necessarily that was the original intent of why this practice was introduced. Practices are often introduced at one point in history and then they're modified and changed, and people add new meanings to them over the course of time. So I think often what the project needs to be is to look for what we find to be the most compelling reason that was offered for that practice. Not necessarily why it was originally instituted, but to look for what the most compelling reason is and to take that seriously. And then to see we may find a very compelling reason for a practice. And another possibility is that the practice doesn't actually fulfill that compelling reason. And I think part of why that happens is because a lot of the commentators that gave these rationales were already committed to the practice. And so when they give a rationale, it's a post hoc apologetic justification for the practice, and it may be beautiful, but it may actually have nothing to do with the practice itself. When it comes, though, to the specifics about what if we find that the practices either don't fulfill that function at all, or we actually don't like the purpose, and I think there's plenty of those. There's a number of rabbinic prescriptions, especially around food, which we've talked about a few times now, that are explicitly about distancing Jews from those who aren't Jewish. And I think for the ones that we find the purpose repugnant, that it's our duty to let go of those. And then the last piece, I'll say the last component of this, I think, is that when we find things like you said, Lex, where it's not working in some way, to really ask ourselves what it would mean to create a practice that would make it work. One last piece of caution around this is that the way you described it, I think often when people ask, so what's the point of Jewish ritual? What's the point of Jewish practice? The answer is, it's to create community. It's to separate. It's to have a common practice. And that's fine and good. But it makes the details entirely arbitrary. So instead of separating milk and meat, the Jewish practice could be that in every meal people eat milk and meat together. Instead of eating matzah on Passover and chametz the rest of the year, it could be we eat matzah the rest of the year and chametz on Passover. As long as the community is doing the same thing, it doesn't make a difference. And I think that just doesn't work for people today when there are so many ways that they could connect hypothetically to other people. They want to connect around ways that actually work in some way, that are actually compelling, that achieve some function in their lives that they're already grappling with, that they're already dealing with. There's always been this tension between those who look for the purpose of halakha and those who reject it entirely and say it's either about authority or it's about community and it's not about the details. And I think we're at a moment in history where we've skewed too heavily to that side. On the one hand, we have people who say it's entirely about not doing or doing because of a God that punishes or rewards. And I would lump into that in the same approach anyone who says that it's about community and it doesn't make a difference, or it's about preserving tradition and it doesn't make a difference what that tradition is.
I want to shift our lens a little bit to talking about the people for whom the notion of halakha is more or less absent. And I want to dig into the question of, what is the case to be made for it for those for whom it might be a completely new concept. And as I've been listening to you talking, I wrote down 4 elements of what I think halakha is or might be. And I'd love first to find out if you think that I've missed them, if there's one that's missing or more than one. The first one is that when you think about halakha, you think about Judaism as something that has concern with all of life, as opposed to something that is, for when you go to synagogue, or for, I think that Reform thinkers often talked about, quote, the ceremonial law, as if the Judaism that we want to retain is this Judaism that's about holidays and services and certain times, but the rest of the time Judaism is not really particularly intimately connected to our life. And I think that the way that the Judaism that I'm looking for is one that speaks to every or many parts of our life. And by the way, that's why I am attracted to a Judaism that is inherently political, because I feel like if it's not political, then it seems like it's not interested in a big part of life that I'm interested in. So what's the point? So the first is the question of Judaism concerned with all of life as opposed to just the ceremonial law. The second is what you said about taking ancient wisdom seriously with a lens of curiosity and not suspicion. The idea that if these things have been around for a long time, that doesn't mean that they're definitely good, but it means that we should interrogate them to see if maybe there's something there that is good. The third is that the idea of Judaism as halakha, as opposed to Judaism as a religion like other religions, is that Halakha is about saying it's not enough to believe something, it's not enough to have a certain value. What makes something work the way Judaism has traditionally worked is when you translate that value into habitual practice that you don't even necessarily have to think about at any point in time. And I think that there might be a few different reasons why that's a good thing. You talked about not having to deal with all the daily decisions all the time about how to do that. For me has never been the driving idea. I haven't felt overwhelmed by the daily decisions, but what I've been concerned about is more that I'm not making the right, really important decisions, because if I'm trying to decide every time it's presented to me, then I'm probably more likely to decide on the thing that feels more good in that moment, as opposed to the thing that best matches my values. And it's really helpful to have a way to say, when you're confronted with this situation, you do X thing, not because it's, as President Kennedy said, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, but it's the right thing to do. And the fourth is that halakha at least has been a system as opposed to a grab bag of random things. And that may or may not be what it has to be, but I think that there's something in the question of, do we want a Judaism that operates as a system where the fact that you govern your eating in a certain way is actually connected to the fact that you observe Shabbat in a certain way? Or do we actually think it's okay to sort of pull them out individually and just kind of put them together, and it doesn't have to be a system? So that to me is four things that I've sort of pulled out of this so far. So I'm curious, number one, whether you think that there are others that are important in terms of just kind of wrapping our minds around the idea of what a halakha of the future might be. And then I want to jump into the question of what would it look like to actually build a halakha of the future that would actually make sense for people who are, non-believers, secular, at least doubtful, whatever the criteria are, and yet, as you say, may not actually have had anything replace what Judaism used to do for people, which was, help them live their lives in an effective way.
I think one of the things you learn in law school is that often you're not being taught that there's a specific rule and then you just know how to apply that rule. An immense amount of legal training is being exposed to case after case after case, to situation after situation after situation, so that when as a lawyer or as a judge you encounter a similar situation or case, it's never going to be identical because the idiosyncrasies of life are such that they never repeat themselves in the exact same way. But at least when you find a comparable situation, you have a whole library, a whole warehouse of stories, of situations to draw on in thinking about how to approach it. And I think halakha at its best very much operates in a similar way. So I just want to put that in as an important piece to all this. Of the four, I agree entirely on 1, 2, and 3, that Judaism, I think, is concerned with all areas of life, that we should take ancient wisdom seriously and probe it and try to figure out what it can say for us today, and that Judaism as halakha, as opposed to Judaism like other religions, is a really important framework. On 4, I don't believe that halakha is a system. And I may use that word, and it's really a semantic. It's a question of semantics, but I don't think that your kosher practice needs to be connected to how you observe Shabbat. What I think halakha offers is that the discourse that all those decisions are part of are the same. And I think having a shared discourse, again, this may just be a semantic difference, is different than having a system, because in a discourse, you can arrive at different conclusions than the person next to you and still be involved in the same conversation. Whereas in a system, there's usually an assumption that you need to arrive at the same conclusions. And I don't think that's the case. I think the important part in halakha is that you're involved in the same discourse. And I think one of the biggest insights I take away from the early beginnings of the rabbinic movement is that when the rabbis were first introducing halakha as a concept, as a way of being, there was no single halakha. The rabbis were basically these individual leaders who were experimenting, doing things differently than each other. And what united them was not shared practice, but shared discourse. And I think over time we've lost that. And I think a large part of why we've lost that is actually the way in which halakha became law. And I think there's something counterintuitive here. We don't often think of it this way. But when halakha started, it was almost certainly not law. Because back then, like today, the early rabbis did not have powers of enforcement, powers of coercion. Their only power was power of persuasion. It was only later, once individual Jewish communities started to receive power from the local non-Jewish governments, that the rabbis actually began to attain powers of coercion, and then they began to enforce certain understandings of halakha. And as halakha became law for the local Jewish communities, that's when we see a narrowing of these approaches, because it's easier to narrow when you have an enforcement mechanism to do that. I think part of what I would love to see is certainly a proliferation of approaches to halakha today, that people are living rigorously in many different ways, and that we're learning from each other in the process. And I think in the process of learning to each other, some of us will gravitate towards others, but I'm not sure that the end result is that there will be a single new halakha for Judaism. What I would love to see that I think is different, that I'm not seeing as much today, is that when people think about their Judaism, even if it's entirely different in entirely different ways than others, they think about it in terms of how the tradition can inform the practices, rituals, behaviors that go on throughout their lives. And I don't think that that's the question that I see enough of people asking today.
I think it's interesting when you talk about law that it feels to me like there are two steps actually that have kind of hardened the halakha as Jewish law in a way that many of us don't want to be part of that. One is that the rabbis got coercive power at various points, but the other is that they lost that coercive power during the Enlightenment, during the Emancipation, and everybody who kind of was grading under that coercive power was able to just leave. And that left the people there who like to live in a coercive environment. And I don't mean that as a put down. You know, I mean, there are certain people who really feel great about it. But that would have the likely result that it would get more and more intense, which it has. And so, you know, that's one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is that the way that halakha as Jewish law in the Orthodox world functions today is actually a modern innovation. And it comes, I think, a lot because the people who didn't want to live that way left, and the people who liked it stayed. And so could you give us a little bit of a sense of examples of things that either you are doing or can imagine doing in your own life that move the halakha from law to away in the way that we're talking about, and or things that you're seeing in your capacity working at the Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah, where you see that there are organizations out there that are doing some of this R&D work, you know. And I guess I would also ask, what not to put you, not because you know, I'm suggesting that you as a foundation professional should sort of put out the word what you're willing to fund, but I mean, I guess I'm asking like what you don't see out there in the world in terms of Jewish organizations that you think there's really space for doing some of this R&D work.
Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah does not frame its work in terms of halakha, but our mission is helping people apply particular Jewish wisdom to universal human questions. And I think the way we've been talking about halakha is certainly one way of understanding that project. Because what it's asking is, what is the wisdom within the Jewish tradition that we can draw on when we're dealing with the universal human questions that we're dealing with, not because we're Jewish, but because we're human and we're alive on this planet. And so we get to the opportunity, really the tremendous opportunity, to see organizations doing this work in a whole host of ways. A few examples that come to mind are one, mitzvot, spelled Mitzvote. It runs out of Hillel on college campuses. And this was a voter engagement effort that looked at and reimagined the practice, the ritual of becoming a bar, bat, bi mitzvah, and asking, what's the purpose here? What's the function here? And the answer it came up with is that it's about assuming communal responsibilities. When we think about what it means to assume communal responsibilities, we don't tend to think of that happening at the age of 12 or 13. That happens at the age of 18 when we become a voting citizen. And so what they did is they took the technologies, the modalities, the approaches of bar, bat, b mitzvah and applied them to voting today. And they created a whole set of rituals, of practices, of ways of marking this moment in life so that there was a habit that could be formed around it for people that were going to turn 18 now and turn 18 in the future. Another example is Mayim Chaim, which is a community-based mikvah in Boston, which has in many ways really asked the question of what mikvah is for. What is a ritual, Jewish ritual bath for? And one of the key answers that they've come up with is that it's about helping people navigate major life transitions. And so those life transitions may be going through divorce, getting married, overcoming chemotherapy. It really runs the gamut. But they've taken this ritual, taken this practice, and applied it in new ways that are actually speaking to people in the here and now. So that when people ask, how do I deal with a major life transition in my life? One of the tools that they have, one of the answers that they have is going to the mikvah, going to the Jewish ritual bath. In my personal life, this really touches on everything I do. I've started to write new liturgy because I find that a lot of the classical liturgy just doesn't align with the functions I think it's trying to achieve. I try to look at the rules of shechita, of ritual slaughter, of treif, not the way we commonly use the word treif today, which is we use to refer to all non-kosher, but the way it was classically used in rabbinic sources, where it's talking about an animal that's torn. And what that means is an animal that's basically sick and likely to die. And so I ask the questions of what are the animals that are sick and likely to die today? What does it mean to have humane slaughter today? And that leads me to a practice that looks very different than what is often considered kosher today. And it often leads me to not eating the foods, the meats that are actually labeled kosher today, because I don't think they live up to the standards that they're supposed to. And so often that means looking into the animal welfare standards. It means looking into the slaughtering practices. Now, we don't really have, speaking of systems, we don't have perfect systems yet for making these decisions in an easy way, because not all this information is always accessible. But those are some of the considerations that I look into around food.
I'm curious to talk with you about kosher wine, because that's one piece. So you hinted, I think, a little earlier about this, because you talked about how certain kosher rules relate to sort of distancing Jews from other people. Kosher wine is kosher because of the absence of idolaters using it for idolatrous purposes. But really, that's sort of morphed into the absence of any non-Jews being involved with its production. And so I wanted to bring up kosher wine on the one hand, because for me, I actually don't drink kosher wine. And people are always confused. And I actually specifically have non-kosher wine as opposed to kosher wine, because the purpose, to use the language that you're talking about, the function for me that I do feel is underlying kosher wine is a function I find repulsive. It's a function I find to be problematic in a world where I don't want us to be. I want wine, which is one of the embodiments in Jewish life of joy and of celebration and of connecting to other people. I need that wine to not have as a kernel of its purpose the distancing of us from other groups of people, especially because I'm in an interfaith relationship, especially because I so often host Jewish events where I have wine with people who aren't Jewish in the room. Like, it's actually very important to me. And I see it as a halakha for me. Like, I see it as a kind of halakha for me that I don't serve Manischewitz at my home. Like, I don't do that. And on the Shabbat front, I wanted to recognize that you and I were reflecting before this call about how each of us doesn't read material related to our work on Shabbat. This was experienced most in college when I had reading assignments all the time. And I wouldn't do reading assignments for school in the same way that I wouldn't do written homework assignments, not because I had a problem with doing the granular stuff of malacha, of like the 39 activities you're not supposed to do. Like I use my phone, I do all sorts of, in college I did. But to me, the function of Shabbat was to pivot away from the normal rhythm of my work, of my homework, of my study, of that stuff when I was in college, so I wouldn't do it. And now what that means, and Dan knows this, is that he'll text me and I often just won't respond for a long time if it's on Shabbat, if it's related to work stuff. I'm not quite as rigid about it. There was a time where I like literally would not under any circumstances open my work email, even though I do use computers, etc., or that I wouldn't use certain things that are like Judaism Unbound things. That's shifted in me for a variety of reasons. But still, I don't do any podcast editing on Shabbat, for example. Even though I'll listen to a podcast, I'll press all the buttons associated with podcasts, use all the devices. But what I bring this up because I am living it, and I do this because I have elements of me that are actually, at least on the kosher wine front and on the reading front on Shabbat, like more strict than halacha. Like for me, halacha falls short. And I think one of the real weaknesses that people who keep halacha rightly level at those of us who don't is that we don't have things like that where we're like stricter. And I dream of a world where, like, to get to Dan's point before, where more of us are unified about, like, you know what, these are things that are actually red lines for us, that like we won't do the kosher wine because of that purpose. We won't do certain kinds of work on Shabbat, even if we'll use the electronics. So I guess I was curious both to hear from you, because I know you have personal practices of your own that relate to this, how that resonated, but also like, what would it look like to sort of channel all the ideas we're talking about into a lived system of, like, I don't know if it's non-Orthodox or non-halakhic or whatever the language is, but of people who are a different kind of Jew, but who are living like kind of rigorously in the way we associate with halakhic Judaism.
I love the examples you gave. And I think the first step towards that is actually reclaiming that term, halachic. And what you're describing to me sounds incredibly halachic. And so I wouldn't describe that as non-halachic. I wouldn't describe it, I think you used the word, those of us who don't keep halakha. I think precisely you are developing a halakha. You have a halakha certainly around those areas. And I certainly share the practice with you of not reading work materials on Shabbat, because I think that that's antithetical to the purpose, or at least some of the purpose of a Shabbat practice. I have not gone as far as you when it comes to not drinking kosher certified wine, although it's something I consider a lot. And the more people I meet who have that practice, the more convinced I am by it. And I think part of it, just going back to what this looks like from a process standpoint, I think in many ways you're actually doing exactly what we've talked about. You're asking the question of what were they trying to get at when the early rabbis prohibited drinking wine produced by an idolater. What were they getting at? They were saying that there are certain things that someone who is producing food could do that would make this food item so ugly. Something about the ethos that they brought to this food is so ugly that we can't bring ourselves to come anywhere near it, even if they were involved in any part of its production. Now, Dan, I imagine, don't view someone who worships another god or worships in a different way as repugnant. But someone who's racist, someone who's hateful, someone who's exclusionary, that's stuff that we may really not want to get behind. And so I think in many ways you're doing precisely this process of asking what is the function of this halakha, and then you're re-asking what the form should look like. And in this case, it's a perfect example of when the form comes out looking the exact opposite of how it looked not too long ago, but it's getting at the same thing. One of the most compelling rabbinic sources I think around this framework is in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And he's talking about the purpose of animal sacrifice. And he explains that originally animal sacrifice was not a goal. It wasn't something that the Israelites should have been doing. But in order to basically help wean them off of it, they were permitted to have animal sacrifice until they were ready to get to this higher more advanced approach, which was prayer. And so he says effectively that there was some goal that it didn't fully accomplish it, but once they tried to look for the goal, they got to someplace better. But then he says something even more shocking, and I think shocking in a good way. He says, it would be as though someone would come to us today and say, actually, we shouldn't really be praying anymore. We should really be sitting in silent contemplation and effectively meditating. What would that look like? I think what he's getting at there is that asking this question is a continual process, and sometimes we may not be ready for the conclusions, but we need to constantly be asking that question. And so you said, what would it take for us to get there? It's about having that conviction, and it's about claiming ownership over halakha and not relegating it to those who interpret it in the most lowercase c conservative ways possible.
So we are out of time, but also that feels like the perfect note to end on, to end with that fiery call to not have it be the case that only the most conservative folks in our tradition, in our Jewish tradition, own it. So thank you so much, Ayalon and Eliach, for bringing that and for bringing all your other thoughts to this conversation. It's been a great one.
Thank you. This was really a pleasure and a joy. I could keep talking with you both for hours about this. Thank you so much.
And thanks, of course, to all of you out there for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we go, we want to send a big reminder, big reminder, Shavuot, that holiday that we are building up to with these 7 weeks of episodes, 7 weeks of counting the Omer, 7 weeks of big ticket, big picture thinking. Shavuot is coming up. It's Saturday, June 8th is the beginning of it, Saturday night, June 8th. It continues on through the day of June 10th. We hope that you will explore what that holiday can be and maybe try to observe it using this zine that Rina Yehuda Newman, our awesome Judaism Unbound and New Voices fellow this year, this zine that they put together. And you can find it on our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and definitely shoot us a note, shoot us your thoughts in terms of how you might plug it into your own Shavuot observances. So thanks again for listening. And before we go, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us in a wide variety of ways, because we really love every last one of those ways. We love when we hear from people via email, via Facebook, via Twitter, all of it. So here's the different avenues you can use. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. Support for this episode comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.